Okay, are you ready for me then?
Yes, ready to go.
Brilliant, thank you so much. And I just want to start by saying how very sad I am that I'm not in Guernsey with you, overlooking that amazing view from Les Cotilles. And I'm even sadder now that I've heard about this evening's entertainment. I would have enjoyed that hugely, but it's lovely to be with you, even if virtually. And what I want to focus on today is the representation of the sea, of the ocean within Les Misérables, which of course was written to a large extent from Hauteville House, where Hugo has this lookout at the top of the house as a site of meditation, of creativity, and a place where he often wrote. And he observed in 1879, he said that what I'm going to do is have the French text up, but I will paraphrase all that I'm talking about. So he said that he'd had two sort of long-standing affairs in his life, which were Paris and the ocean. And just note that the book from which this citation is taken is entitled Océan, the book of his meditations, of his kind of thoughts about creativity and philosophy and divinity, is given this title of the ocean, which indicates its significance within his life, but with also, very much within his work. So I want to start by looking in a lot of detail at a short passage from Les Misérables, which is entitled L'onde et l'ombre, so the wave and the shadow, but also let's not forget that ombre can mean a ghost as well. So this is a haunted passage. This is a passage that's haunted by echoes from elsewhere within Les Misérables. And of course, any passage that Hugo writes about people being in trouble on the water, people drowning, is haunted by that terrible episode of 1843, where his eldest daughter, Léopoldine, drowned on the Seine. And so this passage comes towards the end of book one. Fantine has descended into, she's succumbed to the illness that's being precipitated by her poverty. Jean Valjean has denounced himself at the trial of Champmathieu, and has been taken back to prison. And the passage is using the ocean as a metaphor for fate. And he begins in this passage by highlighting the indifference of the rest of the world to an individual who is struggling and who's unable to manage without the aid of other people. Now, this indifference to human suffering is something that Hugo explored greatly in Les Contemplations after the death of Léopoldine. One of his principal was the outrage of the world continuing for other people in exactly the same way, and the apparent indifference of God to his suffering. And this is brought out in this passage. There's a man at trouble at sea, qu'importe, who cares? The boat doesn't stop, it sails on. And you see the struggle of the drowning man bobbing up and down on the waves until his head, is just a dot, and then it's nothing. And the passengers, can't even see him anymore. But if you look in the second paragraph here, you've got that, the heartbreak of the perspective of his situation from the viewpoint of the man who's drowning. Only a little while ago, he was one of them. He was included. He had an equal right to life and to light, along with everybody else. And it's that, I think, that highlights the fact that Hugo is talking about the poor. We're told he came and went with everybody else. He was a part, he was included in humanity. And I think it's worth remembering at this point that the introduction, the préface to Les Misérables, talks about the three great issues of the century, one of which is l'homme et le prolétariat. And David Bellos has done excellent work in highlighting the fact that the proletariat in this instance means someone who's outcast, who's different, and who's excluded. And throughout Les Misérables, Hugo indicates that the poor are people who do not have the same right to light as everyone else. As Fantine gets poorer and poorer, her house gets darker and darker because she cannot afford, in the first case, she can't afford a house with windows that are large enough, and then it gets darker as she can't afford the candles that will give her enough light to work by. And of course, the living conditions of the poor are stifled, are mean. The air is foul within them. Hugo makes it very clear that the poor don't have the same rights to living conditions that you might think were beyond the reach of money. And, so he's indicating that. Il avait sa part de respiration et de soleil. He was someone who was alive and who deserved to be alive. And suddenly, all of that goes. Que s'est-il passé? Il a glissé, il est tombé, c'est fini. It's almost the story of Fantine represented in the water. 1 minute everything was okay, manageable. Then the factory found out that she had an illegitimate child, and from that moment on, it was over. She fell. And of course, her story is called La Chute. And this passage points, this episode of the passage points to the mythological elements that Hugo brings into his work. He's in this water that is full of monsters. It's unstable. He's liable to slip at any point. You've got the lexis of poverty that comes through when he talks about the ragged wave. Tous les haillons de l'eau s'agitent autour de sa tête. And the glimpses of these depths that are full of darkness. And I think this passage is looking ahead to that very charged episode much later in the book, in which Valjean goes down into his own version of the underworld, carrying Marius on his shoulders, and liable to slip and drown along with his burden at any moment. Sorry. Yeah, and just note as well that he takes a draught of bitterness. Il boit l'amertume. We've already seen in the book the way in which Valjean looks back to the Garden of Gethsemane when he's weighing up with himself whether he's going to denounce himself in order to save Champmathieu. And it is in Gethsemane that Christ begs that this chalice of bitterness should be taken away from him. So I think that that is woven into the fabric of this passage here. And that feeling that all of the water is this bitter draught of hatred highlights that sense of bitterness and exclusion that is part of being poor and excluded and forced to watch other people continue to have the life that you used to have, and that you feel at some level that you still deserve. So everything is weighed against this drowning man, and yet he cannot give up. Il lutte pourtant. Just note as well that when the ocean spits on the drowning man, I think that also indicates the contempt in which the poor are held, that feeling of being spat upon, and that it's acceptable for people to spit upon you all the time. So he carries on struggling, and the boat sails on regardless, this boat that's utterly indifferent to the fate of the drowning man. And it's a place of madness. We're told that the blasts of wind continue to buffet him. All of the foam and the ocean is overwhelming him. He raises his eyes and there's no hope there. All he sees is the cloud and a stormy night. He is present and participating in this entity and this force that any human power, this immense démence, and this madness of the ocean takes us back to the ancient world. It becomes one of the themes that links Hugo's enterprise to the ancient epics that he's reworking, but also offers him a way of looking to the future. And because the ocean is so untamable, so unmanageable, and we are so fragile in its grip, that is why the ancient world created gods who were gods of the ocean. It's a recognition that there are forces beyond the human, and that in order to understand them and to try to contain them in our minds, they need to be given names such as fate or Neptune or Poseidon. And that's feeding in, I think, to what Hugo is working with in the ocean. And it's highlighted perhaps in this passage where he says there's something beyond this world that is coming in to make this man's plight even worse. He's tortured by this madness. He can hear things that are étrangers à l'homme. They're unearthly. They're not part of our human experience. And they're coming from some terrifying place that should not be part of human existence. And he takes us into the world of infinity. Okay. You've got the two infinities that encase him. You've got the ocean and you have the sky. One is his tomb and the other is his shroud. So, you know, here he is still having a terrible time. But look at the language he uses, les vagues monstres de l'invisible. It's that language of mythology and fate again. They are the monsters of the invisible realm, and he cries out and nobody hears him. There's no one there. God's not there. That echoes the episodes in Les Contemplations, particularly à Viquier, where Hugo cries out in grief for his lost, drowned daughter and rages about the fact that there's no cry back from God. God is silent. God doesn't care. I think that's part of this passage. But what Hugo also catches is that terror of infinity and the way in which it's experienced by an individual who is desperate. That calling out for help, whether in a sort of physical crisis like drowning, or a moral crisis, or that, in some ways, an even worse version of this is somebody slipping into poverty who keeps asking for help. Really, no one cares. There's no help to be had. You're on your own. And it's that terror of absolute loneliness in a world that does not make sense that Hugo catches. He cries out, is there someone there? Quelqu'un, quelqu'un, il appelle toujours. Rien, rien à l'horizon, rien au ciel. And, you know, having heard nothing from the humans, nothing from God, he then cries out for help to all the elements of nature, the expanse of the ocean, the waves, seaweed, the reefs. There's nothing. Cela est sourd. And in the end, God help him, he actually starts crying out for help to the storm, and yet the storm is in the power of infinities and the power of the gods of fate. La tempête imperturbable n'obéit qu'à l'infini. It only obeys infinity. So he takes in as part of his being this horror, ennui, l'horreur, and terrible weariness, la fatigue, sous lui, la chute, that fall. And that term, la chute, is a very loaded, powerful term within Les Misérables. It refers to the fall of man in the Bible. It refers to the fall into poverty, particularly of Fantine. Fantine is a fallen woman. She loses her virtue through poverty. It's an extremely resonant and loaded term. Of all of Les Misérables is full of these heights and depths. Abîme, escarpement, chute, descente are words that we come across over and over again. The abyss, the cliff face, the precipice, the fall, the descent. And he clings to hope, and there's nothing. So, you know, Hugo goes through the list of entities that fail: the wind, the clouds, the tourbillon, the blasts of air, the souffle, and the étoile inutile, these useless stars, which is a very poignant image because starlight in Les Misérables is such a powerful and omnipresent force. And towards the end of the passage, he makes it clear that the ocean is a metaphor of poverty, of an unequal society. And he asks us to look at what we are doing to the people caught up in this wave of injustice. the marche implacable des sociétés humaines. Who are we losing along the way? This ocean that sort of welcomes those whom the law has failed, and that absolute absence of help. It's a moral death, and it's not just the moral death of those who are its victims, it's a moral death of a society that allows people to suffer in that way. So the ocean is that inexorable night created by society into which we cast those whom we don't want to help any longer. The ocean is an immense expanse of poverty, people die in it, and who is there to bring them back to life? And I just want to think a little bit about the episodes that sort of within Les Misérables that have their echoes within that passage. So when the bishop tells Jean Valjean that he's bought his soul with silver, Jean Valjean bucks a bit at this. He's not too thrilled to have that agency taken away from him and for someone to be making these decisions on his behalf. He has to make the choice himself to give his soul over to the good. So he leaves the bishop, and then he comes across the little sweep, Petit Gervais, who drops his coin. Jean Valjean bullies him. He puts his foot over the coin, refuses to move it. When the kid asks him for it, he shouts at him, terrifies the child, and the child runs away. And then Jean Valjean looks at himself properly for the first time since leaving prison, and thinks, what the hell have I made of myself that I would bully and steal from a small boy like that? And that is where he breaks down and he weeps on the mountainside, and he calls out, he keeps calling out for Petit Gervais, and there's no answer. That's his answer, that, he's on his own. He's got to make sense of his life going forward on his own. So you've got his cries fading away in the mist. They don't even create their own echo. There's just this absolute silence and this absolute emptiness when he's calling out for help, just as there is in the ocean, where everything around the drowning man is deaf and silent. It's that terror of being in a vast expanse and there's no one to respond to you, no one to look at you, and no one to interact with you, which is one of the ways in which we find out sort of that we're human. That's what tells us that we're human, and that's what's missing for so many people. So he goes into this collapse, this destruction of himself as Jean Valjean, the convict, and that is where his Damascus moment comes in. He weeps for the first time in 20 years, wails and acknowledges, "Je suis un misérable." But the ocean passage is a passage that's rich with references to other works as well. And Hugo's always looking to the future. I was quite struck in this image of the ship sailing by, not caring at all about the drowning man, and how resonant it was with Bruegel's depiction of the fall of Icarus, this extraordinary painting in which a boy falls out of the sky, drowns in the sea, and the whole world just carries on as if nothing's happened. The ship sails on, the ploughman continues to plough his his fields, and of course Auden helped to make the painting famous through his poem Musée des Beaux-Arts, which marvels at the way in which a human life can implode, can fall to pieces, and the world just continues around it. In Bruegel's Icarus, for instance, how everything turns away quite leisurely from the disaster. The ploughman may have heard the splash, the forsaken cry, but for him it wasn't an important failure. The sun shone as it had to on the white legs disappearing into the green water, and the expensive, delicate ship that must have seen something amazing, a boy falling out of the sky, had somewhere to get to, and sailed calmly on. And I also want to think about the fact that Hugo keeps going back to infinity in that passage of the wave and the shadow. He's got the infinity of the sky, the infinity of the wave. And of course, he tells us that the main character of Les Misérables is not Jean Valjean. It's not God. It's infinity. Ce livre est un drame où le premier personnage est l'infini, l'homme est le second. And it's through plumbing infinity in literary terms that Hugo inscribes Les Misérables into the lineage of epic works that he wants to join. He tells us about this. He says, you know, if you were to write a book about the human conscience, even if it were only about a single individual, you would blend all epics into one single epic that was superior and definitive, which is quite a literary claim. So what he's doing here is saying to us, I am writing myself into this literary heritage of Homer, Virgil, Ovid, Dante, and Milton. And my epic is going to be the epic that is supérieure et définitive. So he actually creates an endpoint for epic within Les Misérables. And so he says, you've got everything going on in a human conscience. You know, that's where we find our monsters. That's where we find the desires and the ambitions that drive a human life. You've got the furnace, the melting point of dreams and the caverns of those ideas that we're most ashamed of, the caves where we find the very worst aspects of our lives. It's a pandemonium and it's a battlefield of passions. And now he names the people that he says he's joining. So you've got, you know, in a human conscience, you've got the battle of titans, as you might have in Homer. You've got dragons and hydras and clusters of ghosts, as you've got in Milton, and you've got those visionary spirals, as you've got in Dante. And that naming of his predecessors at this point where he says, I'm writing the epic of Jean Valjean, a single individual with this conscience. It's his literary metaphorical meeting of poets, which echoes the point in Dante's Inferno, where Dante meets the ghosts of all the poets with whom he's engaging and whose group he wants to join. So here's an image of Dante meeting Homer, Virgil, Ovid, and Horace in the underworld. And that's Dante's way of saying, I'm going to be one of you. And it matches this moment in Les Misérables when Hugo names Milton, Dante, and Homer. And there's a whole thing to be written about the choices that he makes. He doesn't actually mention Virgil and Ovid. He likes Virgil, he thinks he's a second-rate poet. And he absolutely hates Ovid and won't mention him at all in Les Misérables, even though actually Les Misérables is a very Ovidian work. And the ocean is an epic trope. It's one of the images that epic writers use over and over again, not just to make their own works vivid, but as a way of saying, look, here I am using the same imagery that links me to my predecessors in the epic tradition. So here we see Virgil's image of the ocean. And just look at the way in which he compares the power behind the ocean to a battle, because the ocean becomes an important metaphor for the battlefield, which we'll come on to. So like a battle charge, the winds pour out, they spiral through the world. The east and south gales and the massive whirlwinds from Africa swoop down, uproot the sea, and send enormous billows rolling shoreward. The men begin to shout, the ropes to squeal. Sudden clouds snatch away the daylight sky from Trojan sight. Black night roosts on the sea. Heaven resounds and fires dance in its heights. The world becomes a threat of instant death. And Homer shows us this image from the battlefield. So he's not actually, describing the ocean here. He's actually describing the location of war. So as a heavy surf assaults some roaring coast, piling breaker on breaker, whipped by the west wind and out on the open sea, a crest first rears its head, then pounds down on the shore with hoarse, rumbling thunder, and in come more shouldering crests arching up and breaking against some rocky spit, exploding salt foam to the skies. So wave on wave they came, Achaean battalions ceaseless, surging on to war. And Hugo, in the Waterloo episode, again inscribes himself into this epic tradition because he uses the ocean as an image of the battle lines. So he says that the line of battle floats and undulates like a thread. The streams of blood flow without any rhyme or reason, and there you can see the front of the battle lines shimmering, but he uses that verb ondoyer, which is linked to onde, which is the word for wave. And later he also says that when you look at the battlefield at Waterloo, it seems as if somehow you've got these two serpents coming over the crest of the plateau. Cela traverse la bataille comme un prodige. Again, we're in that world of mythology, and the imagery of the two serpents, I think, looks back to the Aeneid and the figure of Laocoon, who realizes that there's trouble on the way because he sees the two serpents coming in from the sea, and understands this as a warning sent by the gods. So we're told in Book 2 of the Aeneid that Laocoon, the chosen priest of Neptune, was at the altar slaughtering a large bull, when over the calm sea from Tenedos came two huge snakes, even now I shake. Breasting the waters paired, they sought the beach. They reared among the waves, their blood-red crests towering, while their bellies trailed the surface. Their backs were flowing in enormous spirals. The salt foam roared. And, you know, further in, but further in that Waterloo episode, again, Hugo employs that imagery of the ocean that links him to Homer, to Virgil, also actually to Milton, and points out that an army that falls apart is like a melting of the ocean. Everything fails, everything gives way, cracks, floats, rolls around, hurtles against each other, is caught up and rushed forward, this désagrégation inouïe. And whenever you get words like inouï, something that's never been seen or never been heard of before, you can be sure that Hugo is saying, don't forget that my épopée, my epic, is the supérieure and définitive. I'm telling you things that have never been seen. The squadrons and the battalions break against each other and get dispersed as if on the waters of some huge expanse of ocean. They are the flotsam, the enormous expanse of scum, of flotsam on the waves. And I just want to look back now to what Hugo says in his philosophical work, Océan, about the importance of the ocean to him. It's a place of solitude, it's a place of meditation, and it's a place that drags him towards the dazzling ghosts of infinity, which I think also has resonance with l'onde et l'ombre, that passage in Les Misérables. And he says, you know, you may be seeing that hideout tomorrow, I think, in your tour of Hauteville House. But there he is, standing sometimes for whole nights on end, gazing at the ocean from that height in his house. And as high as he is, he's nevertheless en présence de l'abîme. He's accompanied by the abyss. And it's as if he's suffused with divinity. You can understand how this place was the inspiration for somebody to write the Bible of the 19th century. And while it drags him down into the abyss, which is the abyss of human suffering, I think, it nevertheless encourages him to reach for the stars. He reaches the point, he says, j'en arrive à m'écrier désastre, désastre, désastre. And I spent a lot of time thinking about the way in which the ocean carries Hugo back in time, carries him back 2,000 years to the beginning of the epic tradition. But of course, Les Misérables is a book that is balanced between past and future. It's a book that looks to the future as well. And Hugo knew that that would always be the case. He says in the preface, for as long as these problems persist in the world, and he kind of knows that they always will, you've got that biblical idea that the poor are always with us, his book will be relevant. And so if we look to the future, there's a terrible and tragic poignancy, I think, in the fact that the very body of water over which Hugo gazes while writing Les Misérables has become the tomb of so many refugees fleeing poverty, hoping to make a life, a better life for themselves in a different country. And of course, the whole of Les Misérables ends with the cycles of misery set to continue when Thénardier sails away over the ocean in order to set himself up as a slave trader and to continue that bartering of human flesh that is behind so much of the anguish of Les Misérables. And I will leave it there, I think. I think that's my allotted time. Thank you.